Thanksgiving weekend of 1950, a brutally frigid nor'easter storm was battering the coast of Massachusetts and was particularly harsh on the small town of Marblehead near Salem. Beryl Atherton, a 47-year-old elementary school teacher, had 25 years of service under her belt and was home alone with her dog Esky, a white Spitz who was her constant companion. Since the death of her father, Esky was about the only companion she ever kept, and Atherton was a self-described spinster with no close friends or family. It is said that her favorite pastimes was watching old movies, and she would drive to the movie theater in Lynn to catch a show, but always went alone. With the freezing winds lashing at her drab clapboard cottage on Sewell Street, Beryl ran a few final errands before her small town was due to be snowed under. She made a run to the grocery store to pick up vital supplies, including a few extra cans of food for Esky before she took a few bags of garbage out to the trash cans outside her home at around 6 p.m. that Saturday evening. When she did so, she spotted a young neighbor boy watching her from a window of his home. She gave the boy a wave, and this was the last time she was seen for a good few days. As predicted, Marblehead was completely snowed under through the course of Thanksgiving weekend, and it took until Monday, November 27th, for the town to dig itself out and resume normal activities. The town's milkman, known among the locals simply as Pint, called on Miss Atherton's home to deliver her milk. Usually speaking, Pint would just leave a person's milk delivery on their doorstep, but he knew that Miss Atherton was extremely thin and frail at barely 100 pounds and was concerned about her well-being after such a vicious snowstorm. So on this occasion, he actually knocked on Miss Atherton's door to ensure that she was okay. He knocked once, but there was no answer. Then again, but there was still no answer. On a hunch, Pint tried the door handle and found that it was unlocked. He wandered slowly through Miss Atherton's home at first, calling her name, then walked into the kitchen, finding a scene that would take his breath away. Miss Atherton was lying on the floor, face up, in a pool of her own clotted blood, with Esky lying near her body, mewling in a considerable amount of pain. Pint screamed as he fled the house, careening to the home of one of Miss Atherton's neighbors and pleading with them to call the police. When the police arrived, they deduced that Beryl Atherton had been dead for days. On the kitchen tables were her brown paper grocery bags, still full of foodstuff she'd brought home on the last day she'd been seen alive by the curious neighbor boy, meaning that it had been only moments after this encounter that her murderer had pounced, and within maybe an hour of waving to the small boy, Beryl Atherton was lying in a pool of her own blood. She had several broken ribs and bruising around her throat where she appeared to have been strangled so hard that there was still fingernail imprints in her cold, dead flesh. Her killer had then used a small blade to slice her throat, but had done so in a very peculiar manner. Not only had he cut her neck open horizontally, but had also inflicted a dreadful vertical wound from her ribs to her chin, essentially stabbing a cross in her neck. The cuts were so deep that Beryl Atherton had almost been decapitated, and she had bled so heavily from her wounds that her blood vessels were completely exsanguinated. A sample would have to be extracted directly from her heart by the examining coroner. The killer then let himself out of the house, but not before breaking several of little Esky's ribs as the loyal hound tried to avenge his fallen mistress. Infuriatingly, the crime scene was almost completely devoid of any clue as to the identity of Beryl's murderer. There wasn't a single sign of forced entry anywhere on the property. There were no fingerprints on any surface, and no shoe or boot prints on the ground surrounding the house, and despite questioning Beryl's neighbors, no one but the dog Esky had seen the killer in the flesh. If Miss Atherton cried out for help, the severity of the storm would probably have drowned out any urgent pleas of that fateful night. No one in the surrounding neighborhood had heard or seen a thing. Despite the grotesque violence of the scene, there appeared to be few signs of a struggle apart from a broken necklace caused by the impact of the killer's blade, which had also broken during the savage and unprovoked attack. and aside from a few broken fingers that suggested she had tried and failed to defend herself from her attacker, it seemed that he had managed to sneak up on Beryl while she was totally unaware. The crime scene was so lacking in useful evidence that it had been theorized the killer actually hung around for a little while, ensuring there were no fingerprints, fibers, or DNA present. And since the murder took place in Beryl's kitchen, the killer may well have had ample access to cleaning supplies in order to ensure the scene was scrubbed of evidence. Both police and friends were surprised by the fact Miss Atherton kept a diary, which yielded information about a handful of male acquaintances. Those that knew her were completely unaware of such gentlemen, but the information therein offered no help in solving the crime. It was discovered she had been deeply disappointed over a broken love affair, but this proved not to enter into the case either. In the aftermath of Beryl's murder, with police unable to come up with any suspects or clear motives for her killing, the small town of Marblehead became rife with rumors and gossip. Some said Beryl was leading some kind of double life and had become embroiled with organized crime down in Boston that had come back to bite her. Others believe it was a jilted lover from the broken love affair that had sought revenge after Beryl had broken the engagement off, or perhaps a relative who learned of a sizable inheritance that they either wished to access early or were about to be cut off from. Yet her estate only consisted of about $25,000, and no jewelry or other items appear to have been stolen from the house, so it seems that financial gain may not have been the motive. But chillingly enough, there are some living in Marblehead today who claim they know full well who killed Beryl, and a handful who assert that the killer is still alive. Given that the killer might well be up to 80 or 90 years old, it's more than likely they might pass away before ever facing any charges for the murder they committed. And so, it seems that the brutal crime committed that Thanksgiving weekend may forever remain unsolved, and that yet another cold and callous murderer will escape justice, free to walk the streets in the knowledge they committed the worst act a person is capable of and gotten away with it. Martha Jean Lambert was born on March 26, 1973, to Howard and Margaret Lambert in St. Augustine Beach, Florida. Martha Jean was an extremely popular young lady among her peers and greatly enjoyed spending quality time with her many friends and family members. Those that knew her often described her as kind and shy, saying she had a generally happy demeanor, but despite this, her home life was not great. Her father, Howard, was an abusive, raging alcoholic with a fierce and volatile temper, and her mother, Margaret, could often be heard arguing with him when he came home drunk from various bars around St. Augustine. As a result of this highly unstable and distressing relationship between her parents, Martha and her two older brothers were often cared for in various foster homes, which had a highly negative impact on their academic performance. Yet in spite of such difficulties, Martha was known for being something of a tough cookie, and she didn't let it get her down too much, maintaining a positive attitude whenever she was at school. In 1985, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving was a day much like any other for young Martha. She spent the day attending her usual classes at school, and then, when it was over, she went over to a friend's house to hang out until around 7:30 that evening, when she began the short walk back to her parents' trailer. Only that much is certain about what happened that evening. Afterwards, things began to get very unclear indeed, and mainly due to conflicting accounts given by her very own family members. What we do know for definite is that it wasn't until 3 a.m. on Thanksgiving Day that Martha was actually reported missing. Her family told the police that she was a 12-year-old white girl with sandy blonde hair and bright blue eyes, standing at roughly 4 feet and 5 inches tall and weighing just shy of 70 pounds. She was also described as having birthmarks on both her upper left chest as well as on the front of her right thigh. Last her parents had seen of her, she had been wearing a short-sleeved summer dress. Given her age and inherent vulnerability, the cops started an intense search for Martha as soon as the missing persons report came in. They initially focused their search around the area near to State Road 207, a stretch of 4-lane highway that ran through northeastern Florida. They also scoured areas around Carrylyn Road, the place that Martha and her family called home. Yet despite their efforts, not a single trace of Martha Jean could be found, and to the heartbreaking disappointment of her family, the trail soon ran cold. Strangely enough, from the very moment she realized her daughter was missing, Martha's mother insisted that her daughter had been kidnapped. This is a rather curious detail, as it's a rather specific idea of her daughter's fate. Not that she had been murdered, gotten lost, or ran away from what was undoubtedly a broken home, specifically kidnapped. Martha's mother told police that on the night in question, that she wasn't at her friend's house until the mid-evening, that she was in fact attending a social gathering with her. She had apparently turned to her mother and, in reference to visiting the friend's house, said, "I'm going over to a friend's house. I'll be back in 5 minutes." But Martha never returned, and by the time her mother had realized something was amiss, it was far too late. She searched and searched all night and into the wee hours of the following morning, but it was no good, and by the time 3 a.m. rolled around, Martha's mother was worried half to death. Police questioned pretty much everyone in the surrounding area and found that some of Martha's neighbors had some very interesting information regarding some suspicious activity in the neighborhood. Shortly after Martha was seen walking west down Carrylyn Road that evening, a few members of the local community had seen a suspicious green van in the area, one that was seen to drive in roughly the same direction as Martha a short while after she left the social gathering. And what was most concerning was that not a single person who'd seen it was able to recognize the van as belonging to anyone in the community, and nor had they been able to record a license plate number. Conflicting with his mother's account, Martha's brother David told the police that he and his sister were having dinner together that night during the time just before she disappeared. He mentioned that she had gotten up from the table and walked out of the house, refusing to tell him where she was going before she climbed into the passenger seat of a black sedan. Yet police were forced to dismiss Martha's brother's claims in the face of other more consistent accounts, yet were continuously flummoxed as to why the boy had given them such a strange, fabricated version of events. Despite her mother's insistence that she had been kidnapped, police originally assumed that Martha was a runaway due to the violent and volatile situation between her parents. But it only took a small amount of speculation and investigation for them to conclude that there was most likely some degree of foul play involved in her disappearance that had most likely ended in her murder. However, not a single suspect had been named as her kidnapper, and there have never been any arrests regarding her disappearance. Essentially, Martha walked off that night from somewhere and basically vanished from the face of the earth. A few days after she had initially disappeared, a handful of police officers scoured a wooded area behind the family's trailer for any sign of her, but again, nothing was found. Detectives also put a substantial amount of man-hours into searching for Martha's remains around the area where the Florida Memorial College once stood, but once again, nothing was found. It confounded them. All the places where it was thought she may have either run off to or been dumped were completely devoid of clues. As a result, it was assumed that Martha's mother had been correct in her assertions, and that Martha had indeed been kidnapped by someone who wasn't part of her extended family. Many missing person agencies in the United States still classify Martha's case as a non-family abduction to this day. Yet despite this, police say there is absolutely nothing to back this up, that there is no evidence of abduction, and the green van theory, the one that neighbors claim they saw, has never been substantiated. The one real discrepancy with the whole case is the fact that Martha's older brother, David, seems to have lied about what happened that night. As a result, for a while he actually became the closest thing the investigation ever had to a serious suspect, based on the fact that there were obvious lies being told, and that his story seemed to change in its details on a few different occasions. As was previously mentioned, David claims that he saw Martha get into a black sedan that evening after they had dinner together. But he later changed his story to say that she had simply left to visit a local convenience store and then never returned home. Due to these inconsistencies, investigators suspected that although David might not have murdered her, there was definitely some information that he knew that he was not entirely forthcoming with. After all, he was only 14 years old at the time of her disappearance and may not have been capable of cold-blooded murder. However, in the year 2000, when David was 29 years old, he approached local law enforcement with an outrageously shocking claim. He confessed to killing his sister and told officers that he had disposed of her body in a coquina mine located on Holmes Boulevard. Yet when the police searched the mine, there was no human remains to be found, nor any signs that anyone had been hurt or murdered there at all, which meant that despite his apparently full and frank confession, there was simply not enough evidence to charge David with his sister's murder. But then again, in 2009, David tried to convince the cops that it was in fact him that had murdered his sister, but changed his story from the version he had given 9 years previously. This time around, David claimed that he and Martha had been playing together on the grounds of the then derelict Florida Memorial College building, having left their parents' trailer after a drunken argument had broken out over an overcooked Thanksgiving turkey. David said once they were tired of playing, they walked to a nearby convenience store to purchase refreshments. It was at the store that they began to argue over a $20 bill that David had nabbed from his mother's purse. When the argument peaked, Martha slapped David across the face. David then told police that he had retaliated by shoving her, which caused her to fall backwards in an awkward fashion, smashing her head on a piece of metal as she fell. David panicked, called for help, but after seeing that no one was around to help, dragged his sister's body back to the grounds of the old college before burying her in a shallow grave. Once again, such a detailed confession warranted investigation, but just like the previous occasion, there was absolutely no evidence found to support it. But since the college buildings were demolished in the mid-90s and the grounds excavated, there's every chance that her body could have been lost among the debris as it was being disposed of. However, when Martha's mother was asked if she believed that David had murdered her, she completely rebuked the idea. Even in the face of such an apparently frank confession, David's mother insisted that David often told lies in order to get attention, and doubled down on her claims that some kind of outsider was responsible for Martha's disappearance. Whether or not it was a result of direct pressure from his mother, David ended up retracting these previous confessions, admitting that he had completely fabricated the stories so that law enforcement would give up the search for Martha and declare the case closed. He went on to admit that he'd suffered from intense emotional and mental problems, and it was these that made him outright lie about his involvement in his sister's disappearance, now denying that he had anything to do with it. As of November 2020, almost 25 years to the day since she disappeared, Martha Jean Lambert's disappearance remains completely unsolved, and no human remains had ever been discovered. There are only really two main theories regarding her disappearance, which revolve around the idea of abduction or her brother accidentally killing her. But as previously stated, there is very little evidence to support either theory, and so logically, neither can be fully supported since there have been no arrests or charges. But that doesn't stop many from insisting that David's confession is so detailed and believable that we can't simply dismiss his stories, even though they seem to shift in their details over time. Essentially, the one person whose story deviated may have just allowed a drip of information over time, unable to quite face the truth himself. Then, overcome with guilt 15 years after the murder, he came forward to give a full and frank account of what happened that night. After he did so, David's mother, not wanting to lose 2 children to the same incident, may well have convinced him to retract his confession so that he wouldn't end up rotting in prison. On top of that, the statute of limitations for manslaughter had expired by the time he made his first confession, which raises the question, is that simply a coincidence, or was it a well-timed attempt to both clear his conscience while avoiding any actual punishment for his actions? Either way, it is pure speculation, and the case may truly be that we will never, ever know what really happened to Martha Jean Lambert that Thanksgiving night. And it is a truly terrifying thought that a young girl can simply vanish from the face of the earth, with no closure for her friends, family, or society as a whole. In the early 20th century, Maria Zakharenko escaped from her home country of Russia, feeling the bloodthirsty Bolsheviks who were in the process of turning their native land into the political wasteland that was the USSR. She escaped over the border to China, who at that time had yet to be consumed by communism, as a temporary stopover on her way to the United States. However, it was in China that the superstitious Maria consulted a fortune teller, wishing to get an idea of what her journey had in store for her. The Chinese fortune teller gave Maria some very good news indeed, telling her that not only would she successfully make it to the United States, but that she would give birth to a daughter whose beauty would become globally renowned, but that under all circumstances she should avoid so-called dark waters. Then, after making it all the way to San Francisco, Maria gave birth to a daughter on July 20th, 1938, naming her Natalia Nikolaevna Zakharenko. Natalia would gain the fame that the fortune teller had predicted, but would be known by another name entirely. That name was Natalie Wood. Natalie's mother essentially groomed her for stardom from the time she learned to walk and talk. She sent her to singing, dancing, and acting lessons, training her to be a complete triple threat before parading her around movie studios in the hopes that she would be discovered and thus fulfill her destiny. It was such an intensive experience that it verged on abusive. Natalie's mother was utterly ruthless and unforgiving, separating her from her sisters and even denying her medical assistance for injuries in the instance that this would only make her stronger. Maria paid close attention to the prophetic warnings of the fortune teller too, and made effort to give Natalie a deeply ingrained fear of deep water. Yet despite her efforts, the fortune teller's predictions almost came true on the set of a movie called The Green Promise. During shooting, a young Natalie was set to run across a bridge that was set to collapse during a rainstorm, a bridge that just so happened to run over a pool of rough, dark water. The director insisted that the timing would be just right, and although there would be an element of on-screen peril, she would be entirely safe. But terrifyingly enough, one of the set staff happened to pull the collapse mechanism too early, and Natalie broke her wrist as she fell into the water. Her mother was distraught, believing she was about to see the prophecy of drowning come true before her very eyes. But the set staff, acting quickly, helped Natalie pull herself to safety as she struggled to do so with her broken wrist. If she wasn't terrified of water beforehand, she certainly was then. Maria refused to get her daughter any medical assistance for the broken wrist either, believing that an insistence on doing so would deter directors from hiring her in the future. The injury scarred her wrist so heavily that Natalie would insist on covering the scars with multiple bracelets for the rest of her life, not only because she believed the wound was ugly, because it reminded her of one of the most traumatic incidents of her entire life, so traumatic that she never ever learned to swim and was reported to have panic attacks whenever she tried to wash her hair. Despite her traumas, Natalie had a long and successful film career and would go on to wed fellow star Robert Wagner. They had a rocky relationship and actually got divorced and remarried before having their one and only daughter, Natasha. Then, during Thanksgiving weekend of 1981, Natalie, Robert, and another movie star, Christopher Walken, were enjoying some rest and relaxation aboard Wagner's yacht, named the Splendor, around the Catalina Island off the coast of California. Only one other person was with them, the boat's captain, a man named Dennis Davern. They spend the weekend shopping, sunning themselves, sailing, dining out, and profusely drinking. On the night of November 27th, 1981, after yet another evening of heavy drinking, an argument between Natalie and Robert broke out, one that grew so intense that Natalie demanded that Captain Davern take her ashore on the small dinghy that was kept on board the Splendor. The pair then spent the night in a hotel before returning to the boat the following morning, when Natalie and Robert apparently talked things out and buried the hatchet. The following night, Robert, Natalie, Captain Davern, and Christopher Walken went ashore to dine at a restaurant called Doug's Harbor Reef. Here they continued their stint of heavy drinking, reportedly ordering 2 bottles of wine, 2 bottles of champagne, and numerous daiquiris, with one of the waiting staff reporting that they barely touched their food. The 4 people were so intoxicated that the restaurant manager reportedly called harbor security to ensure that they made it back to their boat safely. That night, according to Captain Davern, Robert Wagner and Christopher Walken argued violently over politics, as well as the direction that Natalie's career should take. He has since stated that the argument grew so violent that one of the men threw an empty wine bottle at the other before Natalie had to get involved to separate the pair. The argument then shifts to one between Natalie and Robert, with Natalie apparently telling Robert that she'd had enough before retiring to her room for the night. At around 3:30 a.m. the next morning, on November 29th of 1981, a ship-to-shore call was made from the Splendor, one in which Captain Davern reported to the U.S. Coast Guard that Natalie Wood was missing. A search begins, one that ended just a few hours later at around 8 a.m., when Natalie Wood's drowned body is found, floating near the ship's inflatable dinghy. The very same one she had used to escape the boat just 2 days prior. She was wearing nothing but a nightgown, a pair of socks, and a jacket. An autopsy showed that she had a blood alcohol content of 0.14%, almost double the legal limit for driving. There was also evidence that she had taken a rather large amount of powerful painkillers in the time before her death. She was just 43 years old when she passed away. Amazingly, on the day she died, Robert Wagner is not intensively questioned by police. It's only a few days later that the 3 men who were on the boat that night are brought in for questioning, and when they are, each tells a suspiciously similar story that details the evening's events. As a result, Natalie's death was assumed to be nothing more than an accidental drowning. The nation was dumbstruck by such a horrible, unforeseeable tragedy, and mourned in tandem with Robert Wagner, who went on to raise their 2 daughters as a single parent, 2 daughters who were almost inconsolably distraught at the sudden death of their beloved mother. Natalie's death seemed to remain an open and shut case for an entire 30 years, until a shocking revelation turned public attention back onto the situation. Captain Dennis Davern, the man who had been captaining the Splendor that night, broke his silence on the case and came forward to state that he had in fact lied to the investigating law enforcement. The nation was shocked to hear that the argument that night between Walken and Wagner had not actually been rooted in politics, but the suspicion that Walken had been secretly flirting with Natalie whenever Robert Wagner's back was turned. Davern said that the incident with one of the men throwing an empty bottle of wine at the other was actually Wagner, hurling the glass bottle at Walken in a rage as he barked out, "What are you trying to do? Screw my wife?" As was previously mentioned, the argument then shifted to one between Wagner and Natalie after Walken had retired to his room, but then when Natalie had tried to do the same and retire to bed, Robert Wagner had followed her to continue the argument. Then, sometime later, Wagner stormed up to Captain Davern, sweating and panicking, and told him to turn off all the boat's lights and ignore all onshore calls that came into the boat. In the aftermath, Davern claimed that Wagner kept him confined to his quarters in order to prevent him from giving a statement to the police, then held an impromptu meeting in which he ordered Walken and Davern to keep quiet about the arguments and to essentially give false statements to the police. In light of such statements, police reopened the investigation into Natalie Wood's death in the year 2012. A re-examining of the information gleaned from her autopsy had one coroner declaring that she had died as a result of drowning, but also from other undetermined factors. Then, in 2018, Wagner was officially named as a person of interest in Natalie Wood's death. Natalie's sister, Lana, came out and gave a media interview, stating that she believed Captain Davern's claims to be true, and had even confronted Wagner on the day of Natalie's funeral in an attempt to get him to reveal what had actually happened that night. This culminated in an appearance on the popular TV show Dr. Phil, in which Lana and Davern publicly accused Wagner of being solely responsible for Natalie's death. However, Lana was keen to make it clear that she didn't believe it to be outright murder, and that she didn't believe Wagner ever really intended to kill his wife. but either became lost in his rage during a heat-of-the-moment decision, possibly denying Natalie help when she had fallen into the water while trying to leave the boat to go ashore, just as she had done just 2 nights previous. Despite the accusations from her sister, Natalie's 2 daughters, Natasha and Courtney, stand by their father's versions of events, saying he had done all he could to preserve their mother's legacy. Courtney is not even Robert's biological daughter, but adores him so much that she has even taken on his surname, potentially as a sign of loyalty and respect. She personally believes and has publicly stated that Captain Davern is a fabricator, one who simply wishes to make a name for himself, exploiting her mother's death for monetary gain, and these claims do carry some weight to them. For example, Davern not only took 30 years to come forward with his accusations, but was also, by his own admission, extremely drunk on the night in question. His story has apparently changed multiple times throughout the years, leaking seedy gossip to tabloid journalists the entire time. He had also written a book about the events of the night in question, one which has been analyzed and debunked by numerous people who assert that Davern's version of events are extremely spurious. When asked about Davern's claims, Robert's biological daughter, Natasha, has reportedly said, "He is somebody who I cannot even dignify with a response because he's so undignified." As for Christopher Walken, the only other person aboard the Splendor that evening, he hasn't spoken much at all about the incident, keeping suspiciously quiet over the years. When asked about how he felt regarding the reopening of the case, he reportedly said, "I don't know," having previously said that he firmly believed Natalie's death to be a tragic accident. In conclusion, it's not entirely out of the question that an extremely intoxicated Natalie might have tried to use the very same dinghy she had used a few nights previous. In doing so, she could have simply fallen into the water and drowned while the other people on board were either too drunk to respond to her cries or simply below deck and unable to hear her entirely. Yet it's also scarily feasible that a jealous husband had discovered her infidelities, either perceived or real, thrown her into the sea in a rage, then simply used his influence or outright threats to cover up the murder. It has been 39 years since Natalie's tragic death, and we are still no closer to knowing the entire truth as to what happened to her that night. And it's not only her family and friends that deserve concrete answers, but society as a whole. Have we had a murder walking among the Hollywood elite for the past 40 years or so? Or has an innocent man been subjected to a campaign of slander when he should have been given room to heal? Whatever happened that Thanksgiving weekend, one thing is painfully clear: that the dark prophecy told to Maria Zakharenko by the Chinese fortune teller in the early 20th century did actually come true, and it was indeed dark waters that became the undoing of the young woman who came to be known to the world as Natalie Wood. On the morning after Thanksgiving of 2003, the snow-covered winter wonderland that was the Horn Creek Conference Center in West Cliff, Colorado, made for a peaceful and serene setting. But that peace was to be shattered when the naked corpse of a young woman was found lying frozen in the snow just outside one of the guest cabins. The young woman's name was Natalie Drissel. Natalie was 20 years old when she was found dead, having grown up in her native Missouri, then moving to the state of Florida to attend college. During the summer of 2003, Natalie had taken a job working at the Horn Creek Conference Center during a Christian summer camp event that was held there. It was here that she had met her boyfriend, who had a full-time job there, and it was during the Thanksgiving break of 2003 that she decided to make the journey back up to Colorado to visit him. With the couple opting to stay in separate guest cabins for the duration of their trip, given the pious nature of their location. The couple spent Thanksgiving together, taking romantic walks around the snow-covered campgrounds, hand in hand. Afterwards, Natalie's boyfriend dropped her off back at the cabin shortly after midnight of Friday, November 28th, so that she could get some rest. But the next morning, the boyfriend went back to the very same cabin to check up on her, yet found that she wasn't there. He looked around a little and was disturbed to find footprints in the snow leading away from the cabin, one that had obviously been made by someone's bare feet, given the shape and size. This must have sent him into a panic, wondering what could have frightened his girlfriend so much that she fled into the freezing night in nothing but her bare feet. He followed the tracks for a short while, into a wooded area around 200 yards from the camp's conference building, before finding her body lying in the snow at around 8:50 a.m. But Natalie wasn't just barefoot. She was completely naked. Her exposed arms and legs were all scratched up and bruised, and by the time her boyfriend found her body, rigor mortis had set in. She was completely stiff, like a wax model, and must have been extremely traumatizing for him to see someone he loved so dearly in such a terrible state. Custer County Sheriff Fred Jobe said there was only a single set of prints that had led them to Natalie's body, meaning she had not been pursued by anyone in the moments before her death. He also said that the pattern of her footprints appeared to be erratic, as though she had been wandering through the area in a daze before she had collapsed. It was also judged that given the state of rigor mortis she was in, that she had actually died very soon after being dropped off the back of the cabin, maybe only 15 to 20 minutes after her boyfriend had departed. An autopsy was performed over at the El Paso County Coroner's Office on November 30th, with the conclusion being that Natalie appeared to have been in a completely healthy state before she had died. Given that there were pine needles in her hair, with dirt and abrasions on her face and shoulder, and coupled with the chaotic patterning among her footprints, it appeared that Natalie had actually ran into one or two trees as she fled her cabin. Evidence of such injuries included, among other things, linear scratches on her forehead, cheeks, neck, chest, abdomen, and legs, small contusions just above the trachea on her right cheek and to the right of her chin, and purple contusions on her left forearm, hand, and wrist. Other than evidence of injuries which the coroner believed were consistent with running through trees and brush, she had no visible external injuries. It is also interesting to note that the autopsy showed that there were no internal injuries to her brain, so we can safely rule out there being some kind of hemorrhage or tumor being to blame for Natalie's strange behavior. While the autopsy did not determine the cause of death, Sheriff Jobe said, "They've ruled out anything criminal. It's just really, really weird, but we're still hoping to find out something more conclusive." Lee Roybal, officer in charge of the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, also commented on the unusual nature of Natalie's death, saying, "It's the strangest thing you've ever seen." Although there could be no definitive answers as to why or how Natalie had died, the coroner was forced to conclude that she had ultimately died from a phenomenon known as excited delirium. She had absolutely no traces of narcotics or alcohol in her system when she died, and despite not being able to give a concrete conclusion that she had died of excited delirium, he listed 6 main factors that had caused him to reach such a decision. The first and main point being that she had been found completely naked, having not been obviously pursued by anyone. There was also no internal injuries at all, and so no obvious way of telling how she had died. There was also the complete lack of narcotics in her system, so there's no way a drug could be to blame for the erratic state she was in that evening. There was also the possibility that, given she was a recent arrival to a relatively high altitude from sea level Florida, that a lack of oxygen in her brain could be to blame for the delirium. On top of that, there was an elevated amount of glucose in her urine, so it seems to be possible that a hyperglycemic state could be to blame for her behavior. As has been stated, there could be no concrete conclusions as to how Natalie had died, but there was much rumor and speculation in the days that followed. For example, there was a great deal of attention paid to her boyfriend, given that he was a natural suspect, having been the last person to see Natalie alive as well as the person who found her corpse first. Yet Natalie's family did not and still do not believe that her boyfriend had anything to do with her untimely death. There was also a great amount of conjecture regarding a supposed eating disorder that Natalie had been dealing with, and that the cardiac arrest she suffered was a direct result of malnutrition. Given the mysterious circumstances and plethora of different theories put forward to explain Natalie's death, it is almost impossible to decide on a definitive explanation as to how or why she passed away. What's clear is that she had absolutely no history of mental illness, had no history of drug use, and was in perfect health right up until that Thanksgiving weekend. Yet suddenly, she appears to have had some kind of psychotic break for no obvious reason at all. One moment her boyfriend was dropping her back at the guest cabin and she was perfectly normal. The next she had stripped naked and was sprinting through the snow-covered woods in the dark at such a speed that she collided with tree trunks as she ran, with the whole episode ending in her dropping dead just a few hundred yards away from where she was staying. We have to admit, the situation is truly and terrifyingly bizarre, with the information at hand raising many more questions than it answers. Although the coroner gave the explanation of excited delirium, it has proved to be a controversial diagnosis. The condition known as excited delirium is not recognized by the World Health Organization, the American Psychiatric Association, or the American Medical Association, and therefore not listed as a medical condition in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. The UK Independent Advisory Panel on Deaths in Custody suggests that the syndrome should be termed sudden death and restraint syndrome in order to enhance clarity. Examples of deaths due to the condition are found primarily in restraint or attempted restraint situations, while medical preconditions and symptoms attributed to the syndrome are far more varied. In which case, can we even place any credence in such an explanation? And if we dismiss it entirely, we are left with a gaping hole in Natalie's story in trying to explain just how she had lost her life. But still, is it possible that Natalie encountered someone or something in or around that cabin that gave her such a fright that it could have triggered a highly panicked state that could have been confused with so-called excited delirium? And if so, just what was it that she encountered? Could it have been some kind of twilight creeper who posed such a terrifying threat that Natalie abandoned all reason and logic, deciding it better to run naked into the snow in order to escape such a threat? Or perhaps it was something far worse, a large, wild, aggressive animal perhaps, that wasn't about to display that same kind of subtlety and was about to smash its way into the cabin to devour her. It's unclear what caused such a state of fear that night, but one thing is clear in abundance, that we will never know what exactly happened to Natalie Driscoll, and that we'll have to accept that here we are, walking the earth, knowing that at any moment we too could simply fall down dead from some mysterious ailment that leaves our loved ones as baffled as they are heartbroken. As hard as it might be to believe, there was a time when Penn State University campus wasn't such a vast, gigantic, interlocking entity. Back in the 1960s, the school was the heart of a small, idyllic, but isolated college town, nuzzled in the bosom of the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania that was given the nickname Happy Valley. At one time, the town's population was even smaller than its current student body, which, for some contemporary students, might be hard to imagine. It was this version of Penn State that Betsy Ardsma was enrolled at back in 1969. She was a 22-year-old grad student, having previously studied English in her home state at the University of Michigan. She was a bright, studious, and popular young woman who had an intensely close romantic relationship with a medical student named David Wright, who was reportedly planning to give her a ring later in the year. In the morning of November 28th, the day after the national Thanksgiving celebrations, Betsy put on a cute red dress and got to work working on a paper for one of her English classes. She spent almost the entire day working on the paper, only briefly taking a break for lunch before she headed over to the Petit Library in the mid-afternoon, a huge, architecturally beautiful structure with a columned entrance overlooking a mall. She worked hard until the late afternoon, until the evening sun was sinking fast towards the western horizon, and was determined to work late into the evening to get the paper finished. Betsy was one of the few students who hadn't gone home for Thanksgiving, and although we're not entirely sure why that is, it's clear that she was almost entirely alone on campus for the duration of the weekend. The rest of the campus was deathly quiet for the holidays, and naturally, the library was even more so. Then, at around 4:30 that afternoon, Betsy ventured into what was affectionately known by the students as the stacks, and found herself alone in an old and secluded aisle of books. All we know next is that she was found collapsed by another visitor to the library, who told a desk clerk that there was a girl in need of medical assistance before they hastily left the library. The desk clerk ran to Betsy's aid, where she was found lying face down on the library floor surrounded by fallen books. They tried to wake her up, but she was totally unresponsive. It was then that the clerk rushed to call 911 to bring in the EMTs. First responders arrived on the scene pretty quickly despite the large amount of road traffic on Thanksgiving weekend, and Betsy was put on a gurney and transported to the nearby Rittenauer Health Center by 5:19 p.m., less than an hour after she had collapsed. The paramedics first thought that Betsy may have suffered from some kind of seizure or other medical ailment. There was nothing obviously wrong with her, but her blood pressure was dropping rapidly and she was completely without a pulse. It was only when she arrived and was examined at the hospital that the doctors noticed the single stab wound to her chest. There was a single knife wound that cut through Betsy's left breast, one that had tragically pierced the left ventricle of her heart. Given the positioning of the stab wound, there was not a great deal of blood that escaped the wound. Most of it leaked into her chest cavity. What little that did was camouflaged by the matching color of Betsy's red dress, hence why the paramedics had been so confused as to what was actually wrong with her and had dithered over what course of treatment they should opt for. But it seems like it wouldn't have mattered if they would have been able to decide, as it was believed that Betsy had passed away just a minute after being set upon by her mystery attacker. Whoever had stabbed her either had been someone that had known her or someone who had actually managed to sneak up completely unaware on her, since aside from the handful of books that had been knocked from the shelves in the attack, there was absolutely no signs of any kind of struggle. There were no other scratches or wounds on Betsy's body, no bruises from where she might have fought back, and no reports of noises or screams coming from where she was attacked. The only thing anyone in the library knew of the attack was when some mystery man warned the desk clerk that a woman needed medical assistance. There were also no signs of any kind of illicit or indecent motives to the crime either. Betsy's clothes remained intact, and there was no evidence that she had been violated either before or after she died. It appeared as if her attacker had simply calmly walked up to her, stabbed her with utter precision and callousness, and then fled the scene before any kind of alarm could be raised. The stab also damaged one of her lungs, causing it to fill with blood, which meant that Betsy would have been unable to scream. It seems that the killer must have known precisely where to stab to prevent her from screaming, but the argument has been made that one can't really stab someone with that kind of accuracy and certainty to achieve this. Like any other small-town murder, the killing caused a shockwave of grief throughout the small town that Penn State is nestled in. The general public demanded the police bring down swift justice, but despite their efforts, there would be no murder weapon recovered, and the only serious clue they had were the reports of a man leaving the library after warning the desk clerk that something was wrong. However, this man was never identified, and there were no indications from Betsy's personal life that it could have been anyone close to her. The police interviewed thousands of town's residents, but gleaned absolutely nothing in the way of serious clues. To them, it could have just as easily been some grand conspiracy by those close to her as it was the work of some crazed, spontaneous murderer. But despite the lack of evidence of leads, there are some interesting points to consider regarding her murder. Firstly, Betsy happened to leave Michigan for Pennsylvania right around the time of the so-called co-ed killer, and the clear and present danger was actually a motivation for her doing so. It's also apparent that, much like the Sandusky case that haunted the university, the police handled the case very badly, and actually opted to try to protect the university's image and prestige over actually trying to find out who murdered her. Betsy's murder also occurred around the same time that anti-Vietnam War protests were rife around university campuses all over the United States, and the anti-authoritarian sentiment that came with it meant that the student body became very uncooperative with the investigating police, which essentially hampered any kind of effective investigation. In terms of suspects, amateur sleuths in the years to come would come up with the same suspect time and time again, a young male student by the name of Richard Hafner. It turns out he was staying over at one of his professor's houses on the night of the murder, and was reported to have a reputation for being something of a volatile person, and one who carried a large knife around with him for so-called self-defense. The professor in question kept this fact very quiet until many years later, when Richard Hafner directly threatened him with violence when asked about the incident. It's not entirely clear why Richard wasn't ever arrested as a suspect, although it's crucial to keep in mind that the man leaving the library in the immediate aftermath, the one who the police believed to be directly responsible, was never identified as Richard Hafner. Despite a lot of things pointing to Richard being the killer, the most obvious being his aggressively violent personality and previous episodes, there is still plenty of reasons to speculate on the possibility of another murderer. The manner in which Betsy was murdered was cold, calculated, and precise, so given Richard's nature, it seems fairly unlikely that it would have been him that committed a crime of this variety. However, since Richard passed away himself in the year 2002, police have lost the opportunity to seriously question him, and if he was indeed Betsy's murderer, a full and frank confession is now totally out of reach. And so once again, yet another murder on an American university campus may well remain totally unsolved, and once again, the cruel, evil individual who so coldly preyed on a single isolated female has been free to walk the streets of Pennsylvania for the past 51 years. Maybe it's a neighbor, someone you see every day. Maybe it's one of your own parents. The fact is, we will never, ever know who killed Betsy Aardsma. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification to be alerted of all future narrations. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit, r/letsreadofficial, and give and receive feedback from the community, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And join my Discord to interact with me and other listeners directly. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations for just $1 a month on Patreon, and maybe even pick up some Let's Read merch on Spreadshirt.com. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all these stories in long compilation form and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. Links in the bio. Thanks so much, friends. And remember,
Clown Nick uphides all the flaws.